Hi folks. Continuing from our previous discussion in the video where we were analyzing the underlying meanings of Julie Heffernan's Portrait of Self as Agnostic, basically what we have after that analysis is a great amount of raw material to work with to shape a draft of a paper in which we analyze that painting. So at this point, each of you should have completed your invention work. From that invention work, you should have lots of ideas about the painting that you've chosen, lots of raw material to work with. And so now what we want to do is take some of that information, not necessarily all of it, but the important pieces. And what we're going to do is take that information and shape it into an outline for an essay. Now, the assignment instructions, if you've read them carefully, will point out to you again that you're writing for someone that is close to you, a close friend or a family member. You are basically arguing your interpretation of the image. So you're turning to them while standing inside of a museum, looking at this painting together, and you're saying, this is what I think this image means, and this is what I think the artist's point was. So all that invention work that you did for your painting that you chose, you won't necessarily use all of it, but we are going to use a lot of it. So the assignment instructions for the essay, the visual analysis essay, ask you to choose the three most important symbols from that image and explain how they're connected to the overall claim that you have identified. So if you look at this outline that I have here, now you'll recall in class we've talked about some of these things. In the intro of an essay, that intro must have a lead-in where you sort of open the conversation and sort of you're beginning to lead your reader into the topic. You want to sort of draw them in, get their attention. Then you're going to give them some background info and context. This would be like who, what, why, when, where. Now this particular essay that you guys are going to do, that would be those first three steps of understanding visuals. The identifying the focal point, explaining how the artist draws your eye there, explaining why you think they may want to draw your eye there, identifying the cast of characters, talking about their facial expression and pose, and then explaining briefly what the story might be. I know that sounds like a lot of information to put in an intro, but honestly, it's really not that much, and you don't need to go into a super great amount of detail about it, but you do need to provide that context. If you don't provide that context in the opening paragraph of your essay, then there's no clear understanding for the reader of where you're coming from or what direction you're headed in with your interpretation in the body. So you have to have all that information in your intro. Now your overall claim will be one sentence that basically states that in one sentence what you see as the overall theme of the work. So if I scroll down here, you can see like one thing that I could use as my overall claim, and it's this simple, is the central idea communicated by this image is the idea of transformation. Now the image that we're talking about obviously is Julie Heffernan's Portrait of Self as Agnostic. And I would have already identified this in my earlier part of my introduction anyway. So when it comes to the actual claim, you got to remember that the claim is one sentence that directly states the point of your essay, which is to argue that the theme or central idea of the work is this one-word idea that we've identified. And from our analysis in the previous video, I mentioned that could be growth or transformation. So really you could use either word, or if you had a different interpretation, that's fine. You just have to reduce the theme down to a one-word idea. So a claim is a one-sentence statement where you directly identify the main point of your essay, which is, in the visual analysis, what you see as that particular image's theme. So back to the intro. In my opening paragraph, I'll have a lead-in, have background and context that I provide, which is those first three steps of understanding visuals. I directly state my overall claim. I'm going to preview my main points, and the main points are going to be the main ideas that I have in each of my subclaims. Each of these subclaims is a minor point that proves that the overall statement is true. Now, if you look at the instructions for the assignment, it asks you to identify 3 symbols that you think are important in the painting and explain how they're connected to your overall claim that you're making or your theme that you've identified. I'll get to those in a second. But also in your intro, remember you have to have a so what statement. You'll recall I mentioned that in the so what statement, this is an opportunity for you to directly address your reader and to get them, basically personally involved in the content of your essay. In other words, you have to show them why this interpretation of this painting matters to them. So for instance, if I'm saying transformation is my main theme, I would have to say something like, and this is why that matters to you in that so what statement. Okay, in the body of the essay, which is what this would be here, the body's where all the details of your argument come. Now remember what I said from the instructions was that you're going to have to identify the 3 most important symbols in that painting and explain how they're connected to your overall theme. So a subclaim is the opening sentence of each paragraph. That one sentence needs to identify what you see as that important theme, as that important symbol, and explain how it's connected to that theme of transformation, which I've identified here in my essay. So a subclaim is the first sentence of a paragraph. It previews the entire content of that paragraph, and everything in that paragraph then must be related to that first sentence. That subclaim must also be directly related back to the overall claim. So let me show you some examples of subclaims down here. For instance, I could say that the image of the butterflies conveys the idea of transformation. In my previous lecture, we talked about how butterflies do that. So basically what my paragraph would be about there is explaining how I think butterflies represent the idea of transformation and how that's connected to the broader context of that argument of transformation that I have identified already in my intro, in the background and context. Okay, so that's just one subclaim. I could also state the acorns at the woman's feet also identify, or we could say also convey the idea of transformation. Now if you want to avoid repeating that word convey in this subclaim because we used it in the other, a good thing to do is to use a thesaurus. Dictionary.com has a great app for your phone with a great thesaurus in it, so you could just find another word that basically means the same thing. So in the previous video, we talked about how acorns also represent the idea of growth or transformation. So in the remainder of that paragraph that begins with this sentence here, we would explain how that idea is illustrated, and then we would connect that back again to what we've identified as the background and the context, which is also what we see as the story as well of that image. Okay, so in subclaim 3 then, I could then relate that to one of the other symbols in the image, and I could also maybe use the windows and maybe somehow argue that windows, since they represent opportunities, also represent the idea of transformation. There's so many other ways I could do this. I could also say, the fire at the center of the image conveys the idea of complete decimation with the opportunity for transformation. as mentioned in the previous video, fire is not just an ending, but it's also a beginning and represents growth and what is to come after the fire. So in the rest of that paragraph, then I would explain this one sentence. Now, of course, within each one of these subclaims, when you're explaining how they illustrate that idea, you got to always bring it back to all of the things that you've said in your intro, in your background and context, and in your overall claim, and in your so what statement as well. So it's really important to always keep making connections between each of the little things that you present in your essay. In other words, you don't want to leave anything open for interpretation by the reader. It's your job as the writer to clearly convey your argument and not leave any holes in it so that your reader completely can follow you and understand what it is you're attempting to say. So you have to be completely direct and very detailed. Okay, so after I have an idea of what I'm going to do in my intro, and I have an overall claim, and I have written my subclaims that support that overall claim, once I have those things, then I can sit down and actually begin writing my essay. So as I mentioned to you, all the information in your invention work, you may not use most of that. But what you're going to do is you're going to go into it and pull out what you see as the 3 most important symbols and look for those in your invention work. Look for the explanation of those things in your invention work, and you can take some of that then and move it into your draft. So instead of sitting down at a computer and staring at a blank screen for hours trying to come up with ideas, now what you have is you've taken this raw material from your invention work, you've shaped it into a rough outline, you've created an overall claim, you've developed several subclaims, and now because you have an overall claim and several subclaims, you can actually write the body of your paper first, which is a lot more effective and saves a lot of time. Once you've got the entire body of your paper written, then go back and write your introduction, because remember, an introduction is a preview of the entire content of your essay. Then you can go back and write your conclusion. And remember, in a conclusion, you're basically summarizing all the main points. All the main points are the subclaims that you made in the body of your paper. You're restating your overall claim, but of course, you're using a different language than you did in the intro. You also have one last opportunity to make all of this argument relevant to your reader in some way. So what you have to do is sort of argue to them why this idea of transformation is important, not only in this painting, but in all of our lives in some way, particularly your audience's life. So once we've got this outline, then sitting down and doing the draft isn't that difficult. It's literally just writing your body, getting it as detailed as you can, then going back and doing the intro and conclusion afterward. Saves a lot of time and effort. And remember that the first draft is really all about getting the ideas down on the page. It doesn't have to be perfect, but your first draft must be a minimum of 3 full pages, no more than 4 full pages. And then, of course, you have to have a title for your essay, and you have to remember that a title must preview the entire content of that essay in some way. So you're going to want to have something very specific. The title's probably going to be sort of long. The title that I came up with here is The Idea of Transformation, and these should be capitalized. The Idea of Transformation in Julie Heffernan's Portrait of Self as Agnostic. When you see that title, or when a reader sees it, they know exactly what you're going to talk about in your paper. One other important thing to keep in mind is that titles of paintings must be italicized. Okay. Also remember, you're going to have to introduce the work, the title of it, and the author's name somewhere in your introduction. That's typically either in the lead-in or in that background context area. Okay, so I think that's everything that you need to know to help you get started on your draft. So do all of these steps first. You've got invention work. Take the ideas from the invention work, shape them into a draft where you have already written out an overall claim, already written out specific subclaims. Then when you sit down to begin your draft, it makes everything much easier. So the first draft of this will be due next class. So that's a minimum of 3 full pages.